International news now.
All right, so the first news story we are examining today is this UN climate change conference in Bonn, Germany. At this conference, the delegates from virtually every country in the world, along with environmental activists from across the globe, met to further discuss the commitments made in Paris. So we're going to start with an audio clip from NPR about these talks, and then we'll talk a little bit further about it. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
World leaders have been meeting in Bonn, Germany over the past several days, trying to work out next steps in the Paris Climate Agreement. President Donald Trump says the U.S. will withdraw from that deal, though that can't happen until 2020. NPR's Christopher Joyce reports on what the rest of the world is doing.
In 2015, governments met in Paris and promised to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. Now they're in Bonn figuring out how to do that. While diplomats negotiate in private, green businesses and environmentalists crowd the hallways. The U.S. government sent a small delegation. They made one presentation on the value of clean coal that was disrupted by protesters. California Governor Jerry Brown was there to explain that American states and cities are able and willing to reduce emissions, even if the federal government is not.
When cities and states combine together and then join with powerful corporations, that's how we get stuff done. And we even have characters like this here to make it the dialectic of...
Heckling by environmental protesters is a regular part of these meetings, but Brown's message that states and cities will reduce emissions on their own has been welcomed as a partial stand-in for a federal effort. As governments negotiate and protesters protest, climate scientists are increasingly skeptical that the Paris deal will do what's needed. Hanna Fekete is with the New Climate Institute. She says new research shows the targets set in Paris are weak, as are efforts by countries to meet them.
What we actually find is that the large number of countries is in the category with weak targets and even weaker implementation.
Countries like the U.S., Russia, and China. The Paris Agreement set a goal. Don't let the planet warm more than 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. This latest analysis echoes others. Even with the Paris deal, the way things are going, global temperature could rise by over 6 degrees by the end of the century. And scientists had even more bad news this week. Global emissions of carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, are going up. That's after 3 years where they remained fairly flat. Environmental scientist Robert Jackson at Stanford University says the increase is mostly from China.
This year, for several reasons, their coal use has ticked back up by about 3%. And their oil and gas use has risen even faster.
China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Emissions in the U.S. went down this year, but not by much, and the U.S. remains the second largest source. And India looks like its emissions will grow a lot. They rose by only 2% this year, but Jackson says that won't last.
I expect India's emissions to rise faster again. They still have hundreds of millions of people without electricity. It's a tough nut to crack.
One thing the delegates in Bonn appear to agree on, the pledges made in Paris will have to get tougher. Christopher Joyce, NPR News.
Okay, let's start here by backing up a minute and reviewing the basics of the Paris climate deal in 2015. And we're going to discuss this more fully, the details of this agreement in Module 23 on environmental politics, but let me just make a couple of points that are important to the discussion about the Bonn talks. After years of delicate negotiations led by the United States under Barack Obama and China, the vast majority of all the countries in the world came to an agreement to reduce carbon emissions. However, in order to get this broad agreement that included so many states with very different situations, the accord adopted one very key provision. Countries were allowed to set their own targets for reducing carbon rather than have targets decided by the collective as a whole and then imposed on countries. Moreover, these targets are self-enforcing. That is, there is no penalty if the self-declared targets are not met. This provision was crucial to getting a deal in the first place. And thus it was welcomed at the time as something of a breakthrough because there were failed efforts in Kyoto and other previous attempts to have this kind of global climate accord. However, of course, there is a danger from such a setup, and that is that states, if left to their own devices, will do two things. One, adopt lower targets in order to avoid the economic burden of reducing carbon emissions. So if they have to set it themselves, they're going to ratchet it down. And two, they might fail to meet even the potentially lower targets if they prove to be too unpopular or too economically demanding. And you can see that even in the United States with the Trump administration pulling out of the Paris Accord. The meeting in Bonn had relatively low expectations in terms of tackling big decisions. The delegates began drafting rules and processes for translating the goals of the Paris Agreement into action. For example, they began expanding the fine print of the Paris Agreement, particularly refining the rules that will help verify whether countries are actually reducing emissions as promised. However, they put off a much larger discussion, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, about how to move forward and expand the targets for reducing carbon levels if it is determined that the efforts pledged in Paris will not produce the reductions necessary to meet the broader goal, and that is to keep global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit for people in the United States, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what was the U.S. doing during this whole thing? Because we pulled out, right, or signaled that we were going to pull out of this agreement. Well, the U.S. sent a small delegation, and this small delegation drew some criticism from other participants at this conference. See, now I was going to be composed here, but McDonald's yucking it up over here. It sponsored a panel on how fossil fuels, come on, how fossil fuels and nuclear power can contribute to efforts to combat climate change. This was not what the participants wanted to hear. They did not read the room right then. And so, so that was that. But there were other American representatives. California Governor Jerry Brown also attended. There was a clip from the audio at NPR, and he had a very different message. He told delegates that the United States was still making efforts to control carbon emissions, even if the federal government was not leading the way. He touted the work of U.S. states and cities, and he claimed that they will take the lead on climate change in the U.S. by cooperating with large corporations to do so. So there was all of this, but that was really kind of a sideshow. The biggest news from the conference may have come from two reports from climate scientists that showed how far the world is from meeting climate change targets, even if the Paris Climate Agreement targets are met. So we're going to turn our attention to those reports now. We've got some maps to show you about that.
All right, so this first piece of news from the climate scientists that shook the Bonn conference was a report on global carbon emissions. This report showed that after a 3-year plateau in carbon levels, global carbon levels have begun again to rise rather sharply. In 2017 alone, carbon levels are expected to rise over 2% over last year's levels. Now, carbon levels are set to reach record highs in 2017, driven mostly by developing countries like China and India. Now, for much of the 21st century, global carbon emissions increased at a rate of more than 2% per year because countries like China and India experienced rapid economic development and consequently built hundreds of coal plants and put millions of new cars on their roads. There seemed to be a powerful link between economic development and emissions growth that posed a huge challenge to any project to curb global carbon emissions. However, from 2014 to 2016, industrial emissions plateaued and remained flat for 3 years, despite the fact that the global economy continued to expand. Now, some observers attributed this slowdown in carbon emission growth to sharp cost reductions in renewable energy, along with the increased pressure to tackle climate change in the United States, Europe, and China. Now, the rebound in emissions suggests the more likely explanation was a temporary economic slowdown in China. Now that China's economy has picked up again, so have global carbon emissions. Now, this development is particularly troubling because populous developing countries, particularly India, still have millions of citizens who live in poverty without cars, air conditioning, or even electricity. As these countries develop, millions of these people will move out of poverty and start consuming much more energy. This will likely further increase these countries' carbon emissions. Now, under the Paris deal, countries vowed to hold the rise in global temperatures since the start of the Industrial Revolution to well below 2 degrees Celsius. For that to happen, climate scientists estimate that global carbon emissions would need to peak in the next few years and then decline swiftly to zero before the end of the century. This latest report suggests that this will not happen without much stronger action to lessen the use of fossil fuels, particularly coal, and specifically in places like China and India. Again, in the next few years, highly unlikely.
Yeah, and this is sort of a shocking kind of scary scenario for anybody who really is worried about the immediate and medium-term effects here. So, but that's not the only bad news that came out of this conference. So climate scientists also warned that current commitments will not meet the goal of that, of achieving that control in temperature of an increase of no more than 2 degrees Celsius, right, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. As the NPR clip said, it could rise up to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And so that's a huge warm-up. I want to make 2 points here, both of which are not positive news for the prospects of controlling carbon emissions at a level that scientists say will be necessary to prevent significant and permanent changes to weather patterns due to climate change. And so there's 2 other elements of here from another report. And so according to this latest report, the first point to make is no major industrialized country is currently on track to fulfill the pledges they made in 2015 in the Paris climate deal. Not Canada, not the EU, of course not the United States. There's this graph I almost posted showing how the emissions were going to plummet if you still followed the Obama administration's policies, but how they're just going to be flat or slightly rising if we don't. And so all of these industrialized countries who are arguably in the best position to control carbon emissions aren't even fulfilling their pledged targets. So that's a problem, that they're not meeting the pledges of Paris so far. But even more so, a problem is that even if these pledges were being met, which they're not, climate scientists are arguing that the targets are not nearly ambitious enough. And there's a graphic on your slide that shows what kind of cut needs to happen for us to really, for the world to really get to the goal of only 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. And so what has to happen if this is really going to work is a whole reorientation that creates much stronger policies than currently being followed.